Welcome to Resilient Earth Radio, where we host speakers from the United States and around the world to talk about critical issues facing our planet and the positive actions people are taking. We also let our listeners learn how they can get involved and make a difference.
We are Resilient Earth Radio, a project of Planet-Centric Media. Today on Resilient Earth Radio, we adventure into the world of transient killer whales. Join hosts Leanne Lindsay, Scott, and Tree Mercer as they journey up and down the Pacific Northwest with guest Josh McInnis, marine ecologist and marine mammal researcher from Victoria, British Columbia. Josh is going to talk to us today about the foraging habits and ecology behind these magnificent animals and what their research has revealed about their habits and their survival on our planet.
Today we have a special guest coming to us from Victoria, Canada, British Columbia. He is a biology major with the University of British Columbia in Victoria, and he is Josh McInnis. And we want to welcome him today to Resilient Earth Radio. Hello, Josh.
Hi, thanks for having me. Nice to meet you both.
Nice to meet you, Josh.
Good to see you moving. I've only ever seen photos.
And so, Scott, tell us how you met Josh.
Well, through Facebook. And we became Facebook friends just shortly after I joined Facebook. I'm off Facebook now, if you're wondering where I went. And during that time, we discussed interests. You asked me once if I could tell you about an opening for any naturalist jobs on whale watch boats in Monterey. I think I had just ended up sending you the names of the companies, which you probably already had. I didn't know of any openings, but a while back, a couple of years ago, you invited us to assist you with killer whale sightings along the coast of Northern California, which we have very few of. But you and I have also led offshore trips, overnight offshore trips. You in BC, the area, and me on the New England coast, the U.S. East Coast. We have those interests and activities in common, but it's really good to see you live.
Yeah, really great to see you too as well. And it's been some good conversations over the years.
And to let our audience know, Josh's thesis, his topic is ascertaining the community and subpopulation structure of West Coast transient Bigg's killer whales in the northeastern Pacific. He's traveled from Washington State to Southern California, Alaska, Australia, Antarctica, and remote locations off of British Columbia. Boy, you've been a lot of places, Josh. What specifically brought you to studying killer whales?
So I grew up on Vancouver Island, and I was on North Vancouver Island, and I kind of grew up in an area where killer whales were kind of frequently, you saw them daily. Johnstone Strait, also off Victoria, where we see killer whales right from the shoreline. And I kind of right away was really into them, but it was one particular event where I saw a group of transient killer whales kill a Pacific white-sided dolphin. It was while I was fishing off a dock when I was a young kid, and about a week afterwards, I think this was 1997. About a week later, I actually got to take part in the necropsy, which is an autopsy of the dolphin. And I think after that, I was pretty set, unhooked. So I kind of spent years whale watching and out of Victoria, and then kind of started developing my research in the early 2000s.
You're also studying rhesus dolphins.
I am. They're my guilty pleasure. I think they're probably one of my favorite species. Killer whales kind of pay the bills and keep me busy, but on the side, when I have time, I like to go through photographs of Rizos, and we've cataloged photo identification with photographs of their dorsal fins. We've got 2,000 animals now in California that we've photo identified, and we work with a program called FinBase, which is developed by NOAA, and we use that to kind of catalog dolphins and track their families. But I'm hoping one day soon I'll have some more time to sit down and just work with that species.
Well, describe what it is that you are studying exactly and what is the purpose of your research. And I know that there's in your information, it talks about that they might require specific conservation management. So describe what that all means and what your approach is.
There's been a lot of back and forth over the years of what the West Coast population. So transient killer whales form multiple genetically distinct populations, basically from the Bering Sea all the way to Southern California. But the West Coast population's always been kind of known, but they're genetically distinct from others, but they've always been kind of known to be part of one or two groupings. You've got animals in California that are really predominantly seen off Monterey or Southern California or, even Northern California. But then you got another group that you hear lots of reports off of Vancouver Island, and you don't see real mixing as often. So government, as well as a lot of research, has kind of gone back and forth about, do they belong to one population? Do they belong to multiple subpopulations? Do they need protection or a specific habitat protection that's different for both? So I've really kind of dove into the nitty gritty data of what each individual whale in this population, where they belong and where do they frequent. It's been a lot of work. I work with a team of people. It's not just myself. I have a team of people that are so great that I work with at the university that are helping answer this question. We've cataloged 556 different whales now, which belong to the West Coast population. And from that, we looked at 159,000 photographs of animals and made 11,000 identifications, which is pretty remarkable in itself. And what we found is that the population does appear to form two subpopulations. So they're genetically related, the ones in California and the ones in British Columbia, but they have different habitats and they seem to prefer different areas of the coast. So that's really exciting because that kind of brings in what we call a subpopulation. And subpopulations are usually considered genetically related, but they prefer different areas. They socialize differently with, they have cohesive groupings. So for instance, animals in California would prefer to associate with animals in California or animals in British Columbia, but there's sometimes mixing. And that brings in a lot of conservation issues because we're thinking about, do we consider all animals in a stock, say NOAA considers them all as one stock, or should we give them protection for California and for Washington and BC and similar different areas?
Is this something that you've been studying too with Metanoma whale and seal study?
We really don't have access to that type of technology that would allow us to see genetically how various animals are related. This is really very fascinating to me.
Right up the alley of Howie Garrett.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also the cataloging that Ted Cheeseman does at Happy Whale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you doing mostly photo identification, or do you have access to the technology that allows you to make these matches? How is that done, Josh?
We start off with the nitty gritty photo ID where we kind of take the images of animals and over the years and we catalog them. And then we have this program, FinBase, that does a lot of, it helps us decipher which individuals that we're seeing. How we do it though is we kind of split up. We do two different analyses. One analysis is social network analysis, where we look at the associations of animals over time, individual whales, because transient killer whales live in a very fluid, dynamic social structure where there's movements of animals between different pods. Animals disperse after a certain period of time from their natal group. But in the case of the social network analysis, we look at the individual whale. Mm-hmm. So we look at the 556 animals that we have in our database, and we look at their associations. And we do it pretty much randomly. We do cut out animals that aren't seen greater than 3 times. And that kind of helps with trying to make sure we don't have animals that are maybe not part of the population that, may have came from Alaska or elsewhere. That then after that, once we've kind of formed these two groupings, and what we saw was we did the social network analysis, we saw these two clusters basically of associating animals. And one cluster was about 272 whales and the other one was about 150 whales. And then what we do with that is we do a geospatial analysis. We have a program that's called ArcGIS that's very famous. We also use a couple other programs, and we run all this data on every single individual. So it's quite time consuming. Every animal is looked at where they're seen, and we test variables like water depth, distance from shore where that animal is seen, distance from the continental shelf break. So say off California, there's the shelf break. It shows where coastal to open ocean habitat is. And we compare all these variables for every single whale, and that then bends every animal into a specific population based on their association and where they're seen in the habitat. So we were able to distinguish two spatially as well as socially different subpopulations based on this analysis. It's an eye-opener because the animals in California appear to be a much more open ocean population that frequents the continental shelf break in offshore waters. I mean, the furthest sighting we have offshore is 121 kilometers. So transients that we know from Monterey that go quite a ways offshore. And then we have another group that 90% of the time is seen within 6 kilometers of the shore. So they're specialized in hunting harbor seals, and they're really close. And it used to be where we used to think that this was a north-south split. So a group of them were seen primarily up in Washington, BC, another group off California. But the thing is that as survey effort increased, we worked with NOAA, we worked with a bunch of different organizations. What we discovered was it's not a north-south. Areas off Oregon, offshore, along the continental shelf break have just as many sightings of transient killer whales that you see in California off Oregon and Washington. So they seem to have preferred habitat, and it's very homogeneous. So it's throughout the particular area. They're not separated based on a border. So that was really interesting. That's kind of the big finding that we found.
Yeah, I would say so. That, it tells you a lot about these animals and their use of habitat. And you mentioned a little bit about their hunting strategies.
Yeah, foraging and their diet. Talk about.
Yeah, so the diet, so they seem to have two different ways of hunting. And this is very much when we start to look at the subpopulation. When you're trying to provide evidence for subpopulations, killer whales culture is a big part of that. And culture being foraging behavior as well as where their habitat, where they're hunting, and their diet. Now, transients have a very fluid diet. It's a lot of different species, but the animals in British Columbia specialize really on coastal harbor seals. Where they hunt is usually in shallow habitats. They usually follow contours of shorelines, in between haul out sites, in straits and inlets, or really close to the surf line on the outer coast. Where the killer whales in California, Oregon, this outer coast population, we call them, they really kind of follow the continental shelf break. And then they go into canyons like Monterey, Submarine Canyon, the famous location, but also Bodega, other Pioneer, all these other areas. And they hunt along the canyon shelf break, where the shelf break, you think, is very different. It's difficult for us to comprehend because the shelf break is underneath the water. It's not visible from the surface like a haul out site for a seal, where we could see lots of life. There's harbor seals hauled out, or sea lions and birds. You can't see it, but those areas are super productive. It's where upwelling is occurring along the coast. It's where elephant seals are foraging, and that's where we're seeing these outer coast animals. They specialize in using this shelf break and using these canyon systems. So in a way, this adaptation to different habitat does cause some sort of social isolation, because behaviorally you're going to it's a learning curve for calves. They have to learn how to hunt the way that their social groups are hunting. The social groups of these animals they specialize. There's adaptations to hunting in these particular environments. So that's going to limit kind of who you socialize with. You're going to want to hunt with someone that has the similar behaviors as you do. So there might be a bit of a learning curve for calves. For us, that's kind of one of the things we're seeing, maybe this separation. But what's really kind of interesting is that they're genetically similar, which means there's some sort of genetic transfer of genes going between them. There's some sort of interactions between this inner coast group and this outer coast group. And where we're seeing it, which is the really cool discovery, is when we did the geospatial analysis, it's happening in areas where the continental shelf break comes really close to shore. So Northern California, Southern Oregon, Juan de Fuca Strait, those areas with the outer coast habitat that we deciphered comes close to shore. The inner coast, they interact at those locations, these choke points. So that was very cool. That was a kind of a neat discovery.
We're talking today to Josh McInnis. He's a biology major with the University of British Columbia in Victoria, and he has been studying the community structure of West Coast transient killer whales of the Northeast Pacific, and also Monterey Bay, and all these other locations that you've been talking about, Josh. I'm Leanne Lindsay. This is Scott and Tree Mercer of the Mindanao Whale and Seal Study here in our region of Northern California. And this is an episode that we're recording for our new podcast, Resilient Earth Radio, which you can find now on most every podcast platform, iTunes, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and many, many more.
Before we came on air this morning, we were having a discussion here in the studio about what pelagic means. Leanne was curious about it. She came across it in her reading. I was wondering, this may seem a little textbook and classroom for you, but you're good at that. Could you describe the way you would what pelagic means?
Good question.
I got in trouble for this. I used to use pelagic a lot for talking about the open ocean. And actually, a NOAA colleague, we were writing a paper on, we published earlier, and I was calling, we call them pelagic killer whales, and actually pelagic just literally means off the bottom. So if you think of the habitat, if you're thinking of ecology, you're thinking the mesopelagic would be the middle zone, depth would be like your twilight zone, or, like the depth in 1,000 meters. Epipelagic is the surface waters down to 200 meters. But the term we're starting to use now more so is oceanic, and oceanic being seaward of the continental shelf break. And that's kind of that open ocean habitat. And so that actually came in when we discovered from this analysis that we believe there's a third population of killer whales that we found that's way out in the open ocean that eats marine mammals. We started calling them oceanics because they're found seaward of the continental shelf and were never seen associating with transient killer whales in California or elsewhere. So that's kind of that terminology, pelagic. I used to use pelagic, and then I still do when it comes to talking about where animals will feed in the water column, like elephant seals will feed in, the middle pelagic, they're pelagic predators, but it's not their habitat. They're part of the open ocean, oceanic.
One description that I read online was, think of it as a column of water offshore where you go from different depths. So different salinity, different pressure, different temperature, light begins to reduce, all of the above. Is that still part of that description?
That's definitely part of it. It's also, for instance, I live in the Salish Sea here. Our coastal waters right here are still pelagic because it's just depending, it's vertical. It's the vertical distribution, where the oceanic, the actual open ocean, that's the horizontal distribution of that habitat.
Very
So
good.
latitudinally.
And Josh, where are you in your process of your studies now on your thesis here?
I'm actually close to finishing. The final draft of this paper now is complete. The first draft, actually, it's now with my co-authors. So this is very exciting. We've completed 2 of mine. I defend next month my research. So that's at the University of British Columbia, which is exciting. But it's kind of opened up a couple of different things. One, I'm accepted a visiting scholar research affiliate position with California State University, Monterey. So there's a new lab that formed called the Ocean Predator Lab that's run by Salvador Jorgensen, who is a white shark specialist. So he focuses on white sharks, and he's
I've heard that name.
done some amazing work.
Yeah,
he's done some amazing work in the Farallon Islands, and he wrote a paper in 2019 about how killer whales redistribute white sharks from the Farallon Islands by preying on seals. And when white sharks are, they can sense that killer whales around the Farallons, that they scare away the sharks for certain amount of time. So him and I connected, and because I was working in California at the time, and he and I now have been wanting to develop a program on killer whales within this Ocean Predator Lab, where I run the killer whale research, he runs the white shark research, and then we mix. So next year, we're sneak peek, we're writing a book chapter coming out that will talk about killer whales and white sharks in California. And we'll talk about their ecology separately, but then we'll also talk about how they interact at their different predatory guilds. So that's exciting. And lastly, right now finishing a book chapter with Marilyn Dalheim, who's a world-renowned killer whale scientist. It's the new Handbook of Marine Mammals that's coming out. So it's the 2nd edition. And we'll be doing the killer whale chapter, which will be hopefully available, have update on killer whales worldwide. So that'll be kind of fun.
And your supervisor is Dr. Andrew Treitz, who is famous. Describe a little bit about him.
He's great. It was really interesting. I wasn't even considering at the time to work at UBC. I've been very, very lucky, though, because I have a couple of really great mentors. Andrew Trice is my mentor and supervisor, but he's also a colleague of my other mentor, Dr. Lawrence Dill, who Larry Dill is a behavioral ecologist who was actually Robin Baird's PhD supervisor. So if you've heard of Robin Baird, who's also studied killer whales for many years, they both connected and mentored me and got me into where I am at UBC. So Andrew is great. He's fantastic to work with. We've really kind of dived down the rabbit hole of this killer whale project, and the lab where I'm at now is kind of switched. It used to be very pinniped focused, so a lot of Andrew's work on stellar sea lions, but now we've kind of shifted to killer whales a lot of the lab. I mean, we've got 2 or 3 projects on southern residents right now and northern resident killer whales. We have 2 transient projects. Well, mine and my colleague Terrence Scarfer, she's doing transient work up here, a much more smaller scale though, looking at more fine scale habitat. So we've got some really cool dynamic projects on killer whales on the go right now, and Andrew's definitely a great person to work with.
And they call this part of the university the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it used to be just the Fisheries Research Center, but because the oceans are just as important as fisheries in many ways, now we redeveloped the program in 2019 to be the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. And then within the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries, we have a number of different labs. So for instance, the lab that I'm with is the Marine Mammal Research Unit, but we also have the pelagic, there's the word pelagic research lab. And we also have the Changing Oceans Research Lab, which focuses on climate change. Project Seahorse, which is they do a lot of seahorse work, but they also do a lot of work on conservation with fisheries, as well as looking at climate change. There's a number of labs and then we have the Indigenous Fisheries Research Unit that's brand new. They deal with a lot of Indigenous First Nations fisheries issues. So looking at fish farms, things like that. So we have a very dynamic group.
And Scott, why don't you talk about your background at university and what you did in your studies, as well as you, Teresa?
Yeah, I'm not quite as well traveled as Josh, but I did have a question before we get to this. Is Andrew Trite still coordinating there was a once a year online conference from, I think, your university, and Andrew was coordinator of that. Is that still on every fall?
It is. We just had one. So it's kind of now become a consortium. So it's Andrew kind of runs it, but also now we really partner with OSU, so Oregon State, University of Washington, and Western Washington. One year we run it, the next year they run it, and we have the symposiums. We have the BC Marine Mammal Symposium every year in November. But then we have another one, which is a student symposium with the Society for Marine Mammal, Pacific Northwest Student Society. And that one is kind of like where we share with the different universities the responsibilities of the symposiums.
I watched that conference a couple of years on YouTube in our living room. One great speaker after another coming up, and that's how I first learned about Andrew Trites. And we have a science center just north of us here in Fort Bragg, the Noyos Center for Marine Science. And Andrew was a speaker last year. I was going to wait to bring up the symposium till the end of this, but
we'd love to have you.
Yeah, we have 5 or 6 speakers each year. Each speaker has an hour. It's like this. It's online. Leanne puts you on.
You choose a topic and you present for an hour, and you share screen and all of that.
Yeah, the whole thing is done online, and we connect to the internet. But then, then Leanne puts you on YouTube. Yeah, so people can see you throughout anywhere.
Well, it was you two that told me at the beginning of the pandemic when we had to move this to the online because we couldn't do it, or they couldn't do it in person. And they mentioned that we just started using Zoom to do all of our interviews because we couldn't have people here in the studio. And they said, Zoom has a feature that can go live YouTube or live Facebook. And of course, I'm from the technology world in Silicon Valley. So I was like, okay, we could do this.
Exactly how it came about.
And we've been doing it ever since.
Yeah, we've said a lot of things that we can do just like that. Yeah,
I feel very honored. Thank you so much, Scott. I graciously accept.
Great.
I'm going to be on October 24th. Actually, I will be in California.
Nice.
I will be. Yeah, I'm going on the NOAA. There's a NOAA California current trip right now that's offshore, and they're doing the stock assessments. I'll be on the Central California leg from October 24th to November 12th. So that works out perfect. I'll likely be down in Monterey for a few days visiting friends. So I graciously accept the 18th is perfect. So
great.
Wonderful.
Planet-Centric Media, Sea Storm Studios, and Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study present the 6th Annual Ocean Life Symposium. Join host Leanne Lindsay with Scott and Tree Mercer as they interview scientists, citizen scientists, and researchers from around the world. Together, they explore topics pertinent to our ecosystem health of our oceans. The 6th Annual Ocean Life Symposium, available now on YouTube.
Now, Scott, I want you to answer the question.
What was the question? You know, my background?
Your background in university, yes.
Oh, yeah. In 1970-ish, I was at College of Marin in San Francisco State. I'd moved up here from Southern California, and I was taking classes there. There's one tired story I've told a number of times, so I won't go into that. But I signed up for an independent study class, which, you know, after about 2 or 3 weeks, you haven't given the professor a title, they come after you. What are you doing? So I'd never seen a sea otter, and I saw an article in the San Francisco Chronicle about sea otters which were in trouble because they had the nerve to eat abalone. So I got in touch with a name that was in the article, Judson Vanderveer at the time, and he was at Hopkins Marine Station in Pacific Grove, actually. He wrote back to me right away and gave me some areas where I could find sea otters quickly. So that turned into not a one semester project, but a lifelong interest, but actually over a year and a half of continuing the study on my own. And then I moved back to New England, where I'm actually from, and started a whale watch company out of New Hampshire. And there weren't any daily whale watches in that area at that time, believe it or not. But, you know, Massachusetts and the Stellwagen Bank and all of that is so famous now. But we were the only whale watch company in the area, and had to convince people there were whales offshore.
You had to convince people?
Oh, yeah. It was like UFOs and ghosts. So we had to get a load of people out on a boat, people willing to spend their money, and took photos. And I got those in the local newspaper. And that was by offering reporters free trips. So the pressure's on when you do that. First whales that we saw on our first trip were 2 North Atlantic right whales out of the population. At that time, we were saying about 350, and now all these years later, we're still saying 350. One thing kind of led to another with the publicity, and I got offered a job teaching marine mammals at the University of New Hampshire Continuing Studies Division. Speaking of divisions, I'd continue doing that twice a year for the next 14 years. At that time, marine mammal studies have grown quite a bit, not because of me, but just activity in the area at the University of New Hampshire. And with 2 other Scott Krause from the New England Aquarium, the right whale specialist, and another guy, Scott Marion, we started a expedition company called Seafarers Expeditions. And we ran offshore trips out to George's Bank. You know, the continental shelf isn't quite as convenient on the East Coast as it is here. We can just about walk off the end of Monterey Pier and fall into that. But we had to go out a few hundred miles to see sperm whales, and we did see sperm whales and brought back the photos. Let's see, we also ran week-long trips in the Caribbean, North and South Caribbean. And offshore trips around the Gulf of Maine. We would circumnavigate the Gulf of Maine, going to the south end off George's Bank, run up along George's Bank into the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia. And I co-began a research station in the Bay of Fundy on the Canadian side in Nova Scotia, and a little tiny dot on the chart, which is called Briar Island at the end of Digby Neck. Well, that's kind of the long of it right there.
And Teresa, you taught high school biology.
Long time, but grew up on Long Island, so I had the ocean right there and spent my summers in the ocean.
And you two met on whale
Scott's
watching.
whale watching boat, yes,
Right.
in Newburyport, Massachusetts.
And that's the voice of Teresa, or as we know her, Tree, Mercer, and Scott of Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study. And I'm Leanne Lindsay. We're talking with Josh McInnis today, who is a biology major up in British Columbia at the University of British Columbia in Victoria. And you're going to be moving down to Monterey Bay. Is that what you were saying after this course?
It's in the process. It's definitely a little easier or a little harder than I thought it would be, but we're currently kind of in the talks of developing a program with California State University, Monterey. So it could end up being more like 4 or 5 months at a time, come down, do field work, and kind of then most of the other part of the year, could be either in British Columbia or Oregon, because we do have a program in Oregon now we're working on with killer whales. So It seems to be the whole coast, but yeah, it could be. I'm hoping.
Well, we invite you up here too to
Sure.
visit with us. They sit out on the beautiful peninsula up in Point Arena by the lighthouse watching whales,
Mhm.
and you can hang out with Scott and Tree.
Mhm.
Come see us at
Oh,
studios too.
absolutely.
I'm thankful most of the time here with the Sea State that we're not boat-based.
Yeah.
We're shore-based. We've had pretty good results here. Well, because of the oceanography, we do have gray whales going by very close, as you know. I'm not telling you anything you don't know about that. When we do have orcas, they come in quite close. Well, obviously, if we can see them. It's funny you mentioned the oceanic population, a group called Oceanic. I just saw that in a report the other day. It may have been from Orca Network that I saw
That's
that.
Howie Garrett
I-
that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I haven't seen that term used very often, so thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
Well, Josh, I've got another question for you. And through all the study that you've been doing on killer whales and dolphins, what do you see as some of the critical issues facing them and what is being done about it?
That's a good question. I mean, the big one, of course, is always the southern resident killer whales. That's kind of the critical population right now along the Pacific coast that really needs the most help. As a apex predator, it's never one thing. It's multiple things. Often predators or any species can handle at least one or two stressors, or but typically when we start to see multiple things happening, like toxins, vessel noise, pollutants, lack of food, that builds up and compounds. And that's kind of where these species can't kind of handle more than one thing. Now, the transient population, it has a much larger range. So in distribution, which means if something's going on in one part of their environment, they can shift their movements to another part of their environment. Transients, though, if you want to talk about what's potentially could affect them, we have the issue of proposed culling of seals and sea lions in certain parts of the range now, like Washington State, Oregon, and British Columbia have all proposed culls of pinnipeds because of the potential for them feeding on commercially important fish like salmon. This is happening the Columbia River, Puget Sound. There has been this proposed culls, and even there's research at our university that have talked about how culling could that help save Chinook salmon. So that could potentially affect transients. And what we do know is that no one has really looked at that. It's always been southern residents, but what could, and the competition between, it's the sea lions that could be the problem for the southern residents because they're out competing and eating their food source, right? They're both eating salmon. But the thing is, nobody really understands that transients are the ecological mechanism of dealing with the pinniped population. Biggs are the balance. They are what eats the harbor seal, what they focus on. So if there is a reduction from some sort of human-caused cull or harvest of seals and sea lions, that could affect the transient population. And that's actually something we dive into in this paper about the intracoast and outer coast groupings from California and British Columbia. How did that develop? They're genetically related. And the one thing I've kind of toyed with, I won't go too far into it, but is that at some point recently, within the last century, the killer whales in California may have, West Coast transients may have had a wider niche. So they may have been offshore as well as inshore. They're feeding on marine mammals. But during that period between 1890 and 1960, harbor seals were culled in British Columbia to 10% of their population.
Wow.
So we're talking between 200,000 and 250,000 harbor seals were taken, either for harvesting or for culling for competition with commercial fisheries. And the same with stellar sea lions. British Columbia between 1912 and 1972, before the Fisheries Act in Canada and the Marine Mammal Protection Act in the United States came out, sea lions were culled to 25% in British Columbia. In Oregon, harbor seals, which aren't as abundant off the Oregon coast as British Columbia or Washington, were culled from around 3,800 animals. Harbor seals were suspected to be culled in the 1960s, between 1925 and 1972. And at that point in 1972, there was less than 500 harbor seals estimated to be off the Oregon coast. So all of these things, for a population like transients that focus on harbor seals, what will happen either is the population will go extinct, or they have to shift their movements to find prey. So one of the ideas we have is that the outer coast grouping in California may have actually kind of formed and specialized in offshore waters because they had to find another prey resource. And luckily, California has always been very good as a state about their protection. Even back then, there was very few calls. We do know that elephant seals, were hunted in the 1800s into the 1900s, and that was devastating. But between like the early 1900s, there wasn't harbor seals weren't really called. California sea lions were called, but not to the extent that we see in Oregon and British Columbia and Washington back in that period. So killer whales may have shifted their movements from northern waters to southern, to areas off of California. And as things rebounded over decades, those killer whales in California may have adapted to being offshore and along the continental shelf break to new habitat because they had no choice. It was either that or go extinct because there wasn't enough food. And just lastly, I'll just say in the 1970s, transient killer whales were rare. It was rare to see a transient killer whale in British Columbia or Washington State. And that's where the transient resident naming came from. Residents were always around. Transients were infrequently seen. And there's no data. So killer whale studies they started in the 1970s. There was nothing really previous to that, so we don't have a baseline information. But what we do have is the information from the Penipet calls, and the reduction in prey species back then would have had an impact on the carrying capacity of the killer whale population at that time.
Now, have the two of you been aware of this culling and harvesting?
Well, I come from a long line of seal clubbers, I'm not happy to say. Seal clubbers and inshore whalers in Newfoundland, Canada. My father's family came down from Newfoundland. My grandfather and his brothers had been seal clubbers and took a lot of small species like pilot whales. In fact, when the summer I worked in Newfoundland, we took a group of people to a beach called Bone Beach, that's what it's called locally. And it was just covered with pilot whale bones and teeth. I brought some of the teeth back with me, but it was from that indiscriminate culling that went on. In fact, I had a reporter say to me once, "So Mercer, this whole thing is guilt-driven, huh?" Didn't have an easy answer for that. But my grandfather lived into his 90s, and he would still defend that activity. I mean, and the whole thing with them was that they're eating all of our cod. You've heard all that before. And I could not shake my grandfather out of that. So to him, everything was fish. And if it lives in the ocean, it's a fish. And that was the end of the argument with him. And the culling on the West Coast here, sure. But this came up a couple of years ago here, that right here off our coast, and there were people involved in fishing off these local towns that we're talking about. The idea of culling came up here with sea lions a few years ago. And in fact, Andrew Treitz made a comment that was really good. I've been sitting here trying to remember the exact wording. I didn't want to misquote him, but it was about how that was not a good idea and why, with the movement of these populations along the coast. You go someplace and cull them. It's not where there's always a high population of them. They just happen to move into an area looking for food. Have we lost you? There he is.
So this is one of the issues facing killer whales and this culling, but also I know that you'd brought up a couple of other issues too, and it could be part of its climate, part of its availability of food, but you mentioned sound. So that's part of what you've been studying, I'm sure.
Sound is definitely a big issue. It's a complex issue too. It's surprisingly nothing has been done on transients with sound, but there's a new study just came out on southern residents, actually, resident killer whales in general, that just got published in PLOS ONE, and it talks about the proof now that, at least in the Salish Sea, that sound is a big problem for killer whales, and it's a growing thing. And I think the reason why we're starting to be able to understand is because the technology's changed. A lot of these studies require tagging, so D tags, like suction cup tags, that can track the movements of whales, their vocalizations, as well as pick up ambient noise from the tag itself. We're getting now information, and it's only a matter of time before we start to do this with transient killer whales. Because transients, they don't vocalize as frequently as residents. They vocalize when they've made a kill, but typically they rely on stealth to find prey, so they passively listen. So it's expected that they would be more affected by sound, by noise, than other types of killer whale, because they don't rely on the echolocation or acoustics to find their prey. They rely on hearing. So in this case, I think the big question is, to what extent? So I assume if I had to develop a study on this, I would take two areas of the coastline. Take the Salish Sea, which is really busy and full of, noise, or Monterey, which, lots of boats, whale watching boats. And then I would take an area like the Oregon coast, for example, where there's not a lot. And I would put tags on whales in these different areas and see the success rate of their hunting and make a comparison that way. With southern residents, though, it's a big thing too as well, because how they forage is different. They're not very cooperative when they hunt. They often kind of separate and hunt fish individually. So the success, especially because salmon's very patchy, especially Chinook salmon can be very patchy in where they find it. So noise is a huge problem. Pollutants are a big problem that we really don't have enough information on. It's hard to say how dangerous PCBs, DDTs, things like that are for killer whales, because what we do know is that the transient population is increasing and they have higher levels of pollutants than residents do. But it may be more of a fact that if the population has declined or if there's not enough food, then maybe these pollutants are more showing themselves more if an animal's already sick.
Mm-hmm.
Where if an animal is healthy by eating lots of food and has, its health is doing well, maybe the pollutants don't show themselves as much because the animal's got a good immune system at the point and can maybe handle some of this. But if the animal is a lack of food, like southern resident killer whales, let's say, if they don't have enough prey like salmon, maybe these pollutants become more apparent if they're already sick and their immune systems aren't working as well. But these things are just theories, and it's hard to really understand them without having a controlled situation.
That makes me think of plastics too in the oceans, pollutants and plastics.
Yeah.
So that would be an effect there as well.
Yeah. Well, what you've illustrated so beautifully, Joshua, is the interdependence and the interaction between species. That no species out there exists by itself. And you mentioned how the lack of salmon, I know how dangerous that is for the southern residents, but now you've let me even see how that could affect the transients as well, because their prey depend on that salmon as well. So this interconnection and interdependence of all the species has been so well illustrated in what you said today. Thank you for that.
And is it also because of the commercial demand for salmon?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
That's a big part of it.
So
yeah.
that's what you were
Mhm.
talking about, I think,
Yeah.
Josh, too.
I think the big thing too is sport fishing. I think that commercial fishing has its place because it does supply food to the world. We do have a large population of human beings, and things need to be done sustainably. But I also think that there's a difference between sport fishing and commercial fishing. Sport fishing is for the sport of it, going out and having fun with your friends and catching a salmon. And I feel like that is very different. The needs of the people are very different when it comes to aesthetics than for food resources.
Sure.
There's no reason for unsustainable.
Absolutely. That's essential, really, if we're going to allow these species to survive and thrive.
And protect that cycle of life, too. And that's what we want to do, is
Mhm.
raise awareness of the issues and what possible solutions there are. And Josh, I want to ask you again about that book that you mentioned that you're working on. Could you say a little bit about that and towards these last few minutes here on the show?
Yeah, so the book chapter with Marilyn Delheim that we're working on. So there's a book coming out. It was first published in 1999, The Handbook of Marine Mammals. I think it was Sam Ridgway, famous marine mammal scientist. And I think there's one or two volumes. Sam Ridgway has passed away, but Tom Jefferson, who's also a very accomplished, amazing scientist, marine mammal scientist, is now the new editor for it. And there's one or two volumes, different species it will be. And Marilyn Delheim and John Henning. John Henning was a scientist down in Los Angeles, California. They created the first book chapter for killer whales back in 1999 in this Handbook of Marine Mammals. John Henning passed away, but Marilyn and I now are going to be updating the book chapter. And this book chapter will have information from distribution of killer whales. We've got some really cool figures of satellite tagged animals which show movements. We've got diet, updated stuff on transients, residents, offshores, other ecotypes. It'll be kind of a very broad information on killer whales in general. We're going to have a really neat figure of a skull of a transient, which will be in there, as well as some pretty nice artwork from colleague that does scientific artwork, Miguel Martins. But yeah, it's going to be a very, very interesting book chapter, and I'm excited. I'm working on it today. We have a deadline of October 1st, and I'm jumping back and forth between this chapter and my thesis and the book chapter, and it's driving me a little nuts.
And it's called the Handbook of Marine Mammals.
Yeah, I think it will be in review until 2025. Probably the new year will come out, because it's quite a lot of chapters with experts on every species around the world. So it's going to be a lot of work, but it'll be a very interesting. And I'll send you guys a PDF of our chapter once it's out.
Like that. I would like that.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah.
Tree is taking our class. She signed up for a 6-week class.
The American Cetacean Society, the San Francisco chapter, is offering this 6-week course on cetaceans. We had the first meeting last night. It was wonderful.
Well, Mark Webber,
Mark
yeah.
He's terrific.
Yeah.
Yep. He's going to be leading many of the sessions, so I'm looking forward to learning a great deal.
We're driving down here this morning from our house to the studio. We're talking about Tom Jefferson and Mark Webber.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, we were.
Yeah, it's funny.
We were.
Funny you mentioned Tom's name.
Tom Jefferson's a legend. He's a really great guy, and I've had some good conversations with him.
And I've been noticing the background behind you, the city that you're in.
This is actually Vancouver. I'm actually downtown Vancouver, but my university is across the bay. I have an ocean view here.
Oh, nice.
Beautiful.
Nice. I was wondering.
I've only been there once. It's a beautiful city. The biennial back in the Marine Mammal Biennial that I went to was back in the 80s. There's been one since then I didn't go to, but that was a great biennial. That's just when they used to be held in one room, one ballroom. You didn't have to run up and down stairs and down hallways then. Now they're in 6 different ballrooms. So
Well, we're now at the end of our show, Josh. In this last few seconds, why don't you summarize again what you're working on, and so that our listening audience can understand what you're doing and what you're doing in the future.
The research we're conducting is it's a large scale study looking at transient killer whale habitat and population structure. And it's really incorporating a very collaborative work with a lot of people, and it's the whole coast. We really want to understand what is going on throughout the region, not just in one area like Monterey. We're working on a few papers soon to be submitted, and hopefully it will go smoothly. But I also just want to thank you guys. This was such a great opportunity. It's so nice to actually see you guys in person. Oh, on Zoom, but I can see you. And I'm hoping one day we can actually meet and have a coffee.
That would be wonderful.
And I drive down the coast every year. I try. My partner and I, we take the trip down, and she and we stopped in Fort Bragg last year, which was very cool. And I think I just missed you guys, but next time I will give you a call, and I would love to meet up.
And Fort Bragg has that great Noyo Center for Marine Science.
Right.
They've got a new location on Franklin, and they have all kinds of exhibits and information about kelp and mammal whales. It's really a good one to see too.
Every time I go there, it's closed.
Oh,
Oh.
yeah. Hopefully they will have the ability to expand their hours, I hope.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful organization.
It
And you'll
is.
always have a place to stay here in Wallala with us, Josh.
They have a beautiful home.
Yeah.
That's Josh McInnis with the University of British Columbia and Victoria, coming to us from Vancouver, Canada, British Columbia. I'm Leanne Lindsay. This is Resilient Earth Radio on the southern Mendocino coast and over the bridge to Sonoma coast. And with me are Scott and Tree Mercer, my co-hosts and co-producers of Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study. Thank you all
Thank
for
you,
being here
Josh.
today.
yeah, thank you,
Thank
Josh.
you.
It's been great.
See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Resilient Earth Radio, where we talk about critical issues facing our planet and the positive actions people are taking. Produced in association with Planet Centric Media, Seastorm Studios, and KGUA 88.3 FM, a public radio station on the Northern California coast. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram and wherever you get your podcasts. The music for the show is Castle by the Sea from international composer Eric Alleman of the Sea Ranch in Sonoma County, California.